Good morning from Austin, Texas. I'm Dick Lonquist, president of Lonquist Sequestration. I have with me my partner, Steve Pattee. Steve, senior vice president for the sequestration division. And today we're going to be talking about misunderstandings and misconceptions in carbon capture and sequestration. So I think we'll start off a little bit about regulatory. So, Steve, tell me what you think the number one misconception in the CCUS world is on a regulatory basis.
Well, I think the big misconception from a regulatory standpoint is that all regulations, all CCS projects are considered equal, and it's going to be equal application of the rules as they're written in the EPA guidelines and regulations right now. Those rules were written for the United States as a whole, and what we are seeing is different depositional environments within the United States lend us to look at different aspects of approaching these projects. And I don't think that's something that the drafters of the regulations had in mind.
And I'd agree completely. If you go back and look at legacy injection in the United States, so class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, and class 5, all the states that have primacy, and even EPA regions, all regulate differently. So there's jurisdictional nuances that have evolved and that will continue to evolve in CCUS. Because California long-term is not going to regulate CCUS like New Mexico, or like Texas, or like Louisiana, or like West Virginia. They're all going to have differences. And I think part of that is that within the EPA world and the primacy world for states that have primacy or are going to have primacy, I think there's a minimum. So I think the EPA sets the floor, not the ceiling, for the permitting process. So if a state, as long as they're regulating to the minimum, they're fine with the EPA. If they want to stack on extra stuff on top of that, which we're already seeing.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, like a good example is Wyoming. Wyoming's added a 1 mile buffer to the plume. That's an interesting concept. We're not seeing it in the rest of the jurisdictions, both at a federal level or a state level. Next misconception is that we have a lot of clients come in that tell us this is a new technology. This is all new. So Steve, talk a little bit about why it's not all new.
All right. The only new aspect of CCS that we have been able to determine is the regulations themselves. Everyone from the regulators to the regulated are learning the rules, are doing their best to interpret the actual intent of the minimum, as you stated, to safeguard groundwater resources and other subsurface resources, to keep the gases contained that we're injecting into the earth. We have been doing that. We have been injecting gases, supercritical fluids, materials of multiple natures for decades. And as a matter of fact, we have been injecting, as an industry, carbon dioxide into various formations for enhanced oil recovery, for example. Or another example would be acid gas injection wells, of which there are multiple examples. And we have several decades of experience in design, construction, and operation of these types of wells. And so the actual application of the concept is not new. the regulations governing this classification is brand new, Class 6 UIC classification of wells. That's the new part, and we're all, as a combined group, like I said, the regulators and those being regulated we're all trying to make sure we fully understand the what's written, the intents, and make sure we safeguard the environment that's our job to do.
Yeah, and I will say that with our clients that we're working for, they do fall into a couple of categories. It's I call it the legacy oil and gas guys and the new guys. That people that have never been around injection, because if you're an oil and gas guy, you already know about CO2 floods in the oil business. You already know about acid gas, so they're over there going, no, this isn't new. This is not new, and they get that the permitting's new. It's the other guys that have not been in the injection world before that are showing up on the scenes, and they really do have a conception that all this is new. And when it comes to the metallurgy, the wellheads, the tubulars, the specialty cements, all that, the pumps, the pipes, everything at the surface, we're talking like 50 years worth of knowledge. All this stuff that you need mechanically is off the shelf. This is not new technology. So permitting is the big takeaway of newness to this. Steve, talk about where we are with primacy and some of the misconceptions that are going on the timeline for primacy. Okay. We're hearing a lot of timeline variations. Is primacy going to take 2 years? Is it going to take 5 years? Is it going to speed up once this next round gets primacy?
So I think there's actually two common misconceptions or imperceived notions with primacy regulatory authorities, with both from EPA and the state agencies. The first, as you mentioned, how is primacy going to work? What's the timing, etc. And then the other is as we alluded to, a uniform distribution of the regulations. They're all going to be regulated the same. We're seeing regulatory nuances not only in how rules are interpreted or additional rules applied to the bare minimums in some jurisdictions, and we're also seeing timing differences between some of the jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are targeting less than 12 months to push an application through. That is, of course, after you get through the line of applications and get into the actual technical review. They want to try to get them done in 12 months, and that is an admirable approach and attempt and goal. With the number of resources and number of applications being submitted to all of these agencies, we are yet to see if that goal is achievable. Some states, North Dakota has already pushed at the time of this recording 2 Class 6 applications out, so they are demonstrating that it's possible. Wyoming is making serious strides to achieve a reasonable review process. But it boils down to the resources available, and it's just these permit applications are so complex, so voluminous, and there's only so many people on staff at any and all of these agencies that reasonable expectations we have yet to fully appreciate at any level what the actual implications are going to be.
So let's talk a little bit about another aspect of the timeline, because that's always a question we get is if we say Lonquist Sequestration, go, when am I going to get my permit? And so, based on your last look, how many applications, how many portals have been opened up at EPA Region 6?
So in Region 6 alone, the last report that we received is just in the state of Louisiana, they're looking at over 100 GSDT portals open, and that's the application process that the EPA has established to digitally upload the applications for review. And so there's well over 100 portals open. That doesn't mean they're complete applications at this time. I think the numbers around 15 are complete, and the rest are being filed in pieces or are not yet deemed complete. But it's, you know, the list is growing, the line is growing, and we really do not see any type of slowdown occurring. Now, on a timeline basis, we typically see the application preparation phase taking 4 to 6 months, and then to deem the application complete, 30 to 90 days, in that range. And then once that has been deemed administratively complete by the EPA or a complete application by a state agency of primacy, at that point your permit application gets in line for technical review. And so whatever your position in line is, that's where you sit. And right now, at the time of the recording of this video, estimates that we're getting in the state of Louisiana anyways, is 18 to 24 months before the application is picked up for review. And then again, you know, the goal they're setting is 12 to 18 months for review. We'll see if that's achievable, as none of them have made it across the finish line yet to weigh in on that.
So that's 3.5+ years.
That's correct.
Wow. And there's more coming.
And there's more coming.
All right, let's talk about the EPA, Steve. And you know, the EPA is divided because we're seeing new players on the injection permitting side that are coming in from, let's call it the air permitting side, the groundwater permitting side, and how you think some of that's going to play out versus injection UIC type practitioners.
So a lot of the professionals in the arena approaching the UIC application process for Class 6 wells, one of the misconceptions is that the expectations from air permitting or groundwater permitting or different, maybe even FERC permitting, all approaches to federal applications should be approached in the same way. That's in our experience, that's not necessarily the case. The audience, even though it's EPA, it's a different group of professionals, a different group of subject matter experts.
Because they're already regulating Class 1, right? In lots of jurisdictions.
Exactly. And so they're used to seeing the applications in particular formats with particular details, and it's very important to understand that not all regulatory approaches are considered equal in the efforts to obtain some of these Class 6 permits.
And that's even going to be more true as more and more primacy takes effect. Because in Texas, the primacy is going to be granted to the Texas Railroad Commission. They already regulate 95% of injection in Texas, so the only thing that the Railroad Commission doesn't regulate in Texas is Class 1.
That's correct.
And that's Texas Commission on Environmental Quality that regulates that. But like in Louisiana, it's going to be the Injection and Mining Division.
That's correct. That's
going to regulate. So they already regulate all injection in the state of Louisiana. Tell me what you think beyond permitting, let's talk about the modeling. And what you know is, so we always thought that the modeling at the regulatory level was going to be challenging, meaning we're developing a model for our client to look at the plume, and that gets turned in with your permit application to the regulator, whether that's the EPA or whether that's a state under primacy. And they're allowing currently 5, maybe 6 simulation models to be used. So what are you seeing right now? How are the regulators handling that? Because we always thought that was going to be an enormous task for a regulator to start reviewing a very complicated 3D reservoir simulator.
And so what appears to be happening right now is that the regulators are considering and or leaning on third-party consulting firms with the software experience, background in generating, running these models, handing off some of the modeling review. Can you achieve repeatability? That's the key. Okay, in any classification, whether it's class 1 through class 6, when a permit application is submitted to the regulating agency, the whatever model, whatever interpretation is turned in, the regulators can't just accept those models at face value. They can't just, carte blanche accept them. They need to be able to produce repeatability. Are the inputs valid? Do they yield a repeatable outcome? And one of the misconceptions is that we've seen it in several instances, these models are absolute, these models are 100% accurate. Well, that's not the case, because as these projects develop, more and more data is gathered, and as that data is gathered, these are actually living permits. These are living projects in the regulator's eyes, in that the expectation is that they will be updated periodically. As a matter of fact, in the regulations, at a minimum, they have to be updated and amended every 5 years. Some states are requiring less time, 3 years duration, but at a minimum, it's every 5 years. And so these models are not 100% accurate, but the regulators need to be able to achieve repeatability to know that the model is valid, at least. And then the expectations are that as new data comes in, we're going to update these models. Now, the regulators do have the capability. Again, it's identifying, generating new resources to help in the review process, in the regulatory process, in the oversight process. We, as an industry as a whole, we need to increase the resources available to us. And one way that they are looking at is possibly using, third party, as I said, groups that, here's the model, here's the inputs, here's the actual data native file, hit run. Do you achieve repeatability? Are there issues? Identify those issues, perform a gap analysis in the review process, and move on to fully develop that an approved, accepted model for a particular project. And so I think that's a very good approach, just because resources are so limited, and if we can capitalize on subject matter expertise within the industry as a whole, I think that's a very, very viable and reasonable approach.
So we're seeing some overtures from clients that lots of them have the opinion that the permitting process is established and is not evolving. It is evolving.
Very much so.
We think there's going to be jurisdictional nuances. There's going to be legislative things that are going to happen both at state level and EPA level. I'd maybe call it things like oops when we were writing the law or the regulations, we didn't think about that. And so we're getting a laundry list of things that the regulators are having to deal with. So there's probably going to be, what would you say, Steve, time-wise? You know, we might get in a groove 10 years from now, or it's always going to be evolving.
I think so. It goes back to, Dick, the variability in the data. Okay, right now we have limited data in some of these environments, where the initial round of these projects is going after previously, for the most part, unexplored regions, where oil and gas companies did not spend time, effort, money to investigate these areas, because they were saline aquifers. They were not productive. They did not have the necessary geologic, structural, trapping mechanisms and conditions that would support hydrocarbon collection and further future exploitation. So our data, available data today, is on the low end of the spectrum. And so the regulations were written as a broad overview of minimum expectations of what would be required to fully evaluate and vet one of these projects in the design and characterization of projects in the project area. And so as more and more data comes in, as we start experiencing or being exposed to different depositional environments, for example, there's going to be some discussions back and forth, state regulators, EPA regulators, back and forth, to make sure that the final oversight for a given project properly reflects, and more importantly, protects the area of interest in the best way possible. And the application of some of the expectations, some of the technologies, these wells in some of these depositional environments are not going to behave the same. And so as the design side, as the site characterization, regulatory side, we have to be able to understand how to adapt to still meet the desired goal of the regulations, but design something that will work for the environment that we're in our area of interest. And so, so I think there's going to be some fluid movement in interpretations. I think as states get primacy, I think that you will see that they will have specific requirements that look different from the regulations for the United States as a whole.
Well, and we've seen that on all other classes of injection wells.
That's correct.
So, and to give you an example, Louisiana, on a Class 3 salt cavern, the permit application is 3 6-inch binders and takes 2 years to process. Go over to Mississippi, same primacy. The permit application is 1/4 inch thick, and I can have my permit in 45 days. Same primacy. So a big misconception is, as this evolves and as states get primacy, if you are a company that has 10 different CCUS projects across the United States, you might have 10 very different permit applications.
Yeah, that's true.
And so understanding what that local regulator wants, because you're like, oh, well, I've already filed 5 permits in Texas, so I'm gonna take that playbook and I'm gonna run up to Wyoming. Well, you're gonna get corrected very quickly, because it's different. North Dakota's gonna be different. And the timelines are going to be hugely different.
Yep.
So we've had the change with the federal tax credit. So talk a little bit about how you think that's changed the model, because I can tell you we're busier now than we've ever been. So I think when we went from the old tax credit to the new tax credit, I've seen an enormous new group of players hit the market, and the change to direct air capture. We got direct air capture clients that have now showed up that would have probably never been in the game at the old tax credit. So our takeaway today is the timeline in most jurisdictions has probably slipped. There's an original timeline, let's say 3 years ago, that we thought it might be 2 years to get a permit. Now we're looking at 3.5 plus, maybe shorter in the two current primacy states. Any update on primacy for Louisiana?
Last report we had was that the EPA reached out with the final comment issuance. There was one part of the regulations they wanted modified, updated, and then the EPA is getting ready to issue public notice of final decision for primacy. Expectations range from 4 months to before the end of the year. So, but it does look like at this point that EPA will issue primacy to Louisiana before the end of 23.
Okay. There's also a misconception on whether, depending on what state you're in, but notice of deficiencies or RAD letters that there are clients that are very concerned that their permits are getting NODs and RAD notices. Have you ever filed an injection permit that didn't have any comment?
No. That is one of the misconceptions, that for underground injection control permit applications, some of the more streamlined applications, maybe saltwater disposal well, might have far less comments.
An oil and gas disposal well.
Or an oil and gas disposal
lease
well.
disposal.
Right. You might get one through there. But when you get into these complex, multi-binder, plus 1,000, plus 1,500 page applications, I do not see any possibility of getting one through without at least one round of comments. That is a misconception that it's got to be perfect the first time. There's in voluminous applications of this nature, that's not possible.
And we've seen it with because it is a thing outside the United States, that when you're filing permits in certain jurisdictions around the world, you only have so many bites at the apple with the regulator on that permit application. Where that's not true here. Depending on the regulator you get, you might have 4 RAD letters to get a class 1 well or a class 6 well through at one jurisdiction, and other jurisdiction they might get all their stuff done in one NOD.
Yeah. Now where you could get into trouble is if the comments you're receiving from the application review reflect the same issue, and that issue is not being corrected. But in all instances that we've been involved with, here's something that we need additional information on. We need you to expand upon your interpretation or definition. Once that's done, move on. There are situations where if this condition is not changed in the proposed way of your design or how you plan to operate a well, we're going to deny the permit. That is possible. You have to make a change because they've identified, that the regulators in the review have identified an actual deal killing detail. But as long as you correct that detail and make adjustments, then the application review process continues. We have seen some folks be requested to change a detail. They don't change it to the satisfaction of the regulators. They get asked again and again and again, and finally they said, "You're not willing to change. We're not budging. We're not moving." So denied. And so that that is possible, but in most instances, the review process just continues, and it's multiple rounds of comments. It's usually we want a little bit extra explanation or a little bit more clarification on a definition, something along those lines.
Preferred formats. We talked a little bit about this earlier. We're absolutely seeing that.
Yes.
So and we've talked a little bit about this, but one of the big misconceptions is I can develop a permit application and I can deploy it nationwide. That's not going to happen.
Most likely, it's not going to happen. It can happen. It's probably not the most advisable approach. One of the things that we have to take in consideration when we file these applications, we have to understand our audience, right? The regulators that we're talking to. Some regulators, through experience and history working with them, we understand how they review, how they look at certain applications, how they, what their process is. And if you create something that works in one jurisdiction, but their expectations is something different, then it could very well, and most likely will, slow down the process, create some stumbling blocks, some tripping hazards in the review process, and complicate the effort.
Because these regulators at some level are operating in a silo. Sometimes there's communication with other regulators around the country, and sometimes there's not. These regulators might know each other in different states or different EPA jurisdictions, but they don't communicate on a day-to-day basis. In fact, they might go have a cocktail with another regulator at the Groundwater Protection Council meeting, once a year, but really don't always pick up the phone and say, "Hey, what are y'all doing in your state?" They come up with a solution. What we're seeing with a lot of regulators, they come up with a solution in a silo, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the concept of being able to uniformly regulate Class 6 across the United States is just not going to happen. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, in my opinion, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot today. We really appreciate everybody joining us.
Thank you.
From Austin, Texas, and thanks again for CarbonExpo for having us back for CarbonExpo #2. Wish you well. Thanks.
Thank you.